So, Mike, tell me, what fun have you had on the internet? What fun have you come across? What made you smile?
So this one is fantastic. This is something called Chipotle Max. Instead of the E at the end of Chipotle, as the restaurant chain is called. Do you have Chipotle in the UK? Is that?
I don't think we do.
Okay.
Certainly not in London, where I live.
Okay. It's a burrito place, and it's,
right.
It's good. You should have it next time you're in the U.S.
Okay.
They had some trouble a few years ago where people were getting sick eating them, but I think they fixed that. But anyways, this is Chipotle, but instead of an E at the end of Chipotle, it's AI, Chipotle Max. And what happened was somebody discovered that Chipotle, the restaurant, has a support chat that is powered by AI on their website, but they left it exposed, let's say, such that people could get the Chipotle customer service bot to respond to other things and give you free AI if you wanted it. And so they built a tool that taps into that and allows you to effectively get free AI power, free AI tokens, thanks to the burrito shop.
But buy a burrito, get some AI access for free. I think that's a fair deal. It seems to be where the world's going right now.
Yeah. And they do warn you that, this could be fixed and Chipotle could close it off, but they're in the process of trying to add AI support from Home Depot, Nordstrom, Sephora, IKEA, and many others. So you may get free AI from all of these customer support chatbots that are not properly secured.
So have people been building stuff with?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, it's just
amazing.
Out there.
Have you been vibe coding with the Chipotle?
I have not. There are limits to the things I'm willing to experiment with, but it's. I thought this was absolutely hilarious.
Yeah, great, and speaks to some of the stories we'll talk about today.
Yeah. What about you? What fun thing did you find?
Well, after you alerted me to 82 and 0, that very fun basketball game, and I've got more into basketball over the last few weeks, as we might touch on. Inevitably, there is now a World Cup version of that game.
Of course.
And it's called 7 and 0. We'll leave the URL in the show notes if you want to kind of spend a lot of time over the next few weeks while the World Cup is on trying to beat this game. But essentially, you have to pick a squad from all of the years of the World Cup and get 7 games in a row. And I haven't managed to do it yet.
You sent this to me yesterday and I was playing around with it and I am not good. I also know very little about World Cup football, but yeah, I'm not good at it.
No. Well, by the time this World Cup, which is in your fair nation, at least some of the games ends, maybe that will be different. And
I'll pay attention.
You'll be breezing through this 7-0 game before long. So yeah, happy World Cup day to those who celebrate. Hello and welcome to Ctrl-Alt-Speech, the podcast where we make sense of the major debates shaping online speech, platform power, content moderation, and the future of the internet. It's June the 11th, 2026, and this week we're talking about Apple's increasingly large role in the safety stack, the reaction to the Oversight Board's big announcement last week, and for our Patreon subscribers, why Anthropic's powerful new model hasn't had the easiest of starts. Ctrl-Alt-Speech is the internet version of Monday Night Football, with Mike Masnick, founder and editor of Tech Dirt, and me, Ben Whitelaw.
These are getting better and better.
Founder and editor of Everything in Moderation. You know, the thing about that reference, Mike, is that it speaks to both your version of football and my version of football.
Okay. You have a Monday Night Football in the UK as well?
There's a soccer Monday Night Football, which is, as you might expect, pundits talking around the Monday game of the Premier League. And I also found out when I was preparing for today's podcast that you also have that, but for football.
Yeah, for NFL football. Yeah. No, it is one special game each week. Most games are on Sunday, and they have one unique game that is on Monday night, and it is a tradition in the US.
I think the Premier League, the UK Premier League, stole that from the NFL.
Possibly.
We didn't always have that. Now we do. Which means we can use that reference. We are up against it in loads of ways today, Mike. We have so many stories that we're trying to kind of cram in today's episode. We're also trying to finish before 8 p.m. UK time. So, at least I can watch some of Mexico versus South Africa.
There we go.
Which is the first game of this year's World Cup. You mentioned you're not a fan, but are you going to be tuning in? What's your plan for the next few weeks?
I had not directly planned to tune in, but I am sure I will. Right now I've been pretty focused on basketball because that's where the NBA finals have taken up my sports focus right now. But I'm sure I'll start to tune in to the World Cup games as well.
Yeah. As soon as the Knicks win the next game, right?
Yeah, they just need to win one more. So
one more game. We were talking before we started recording about the big result last night.
Yeah, it was fantastic. The best basketball game I think I've ever watched in my life.
High praise. Yeah. I mean, if the World Cup can get anywhere close to that, it will have done well. And I enjoyed watching the highlights. Now that I am an honorary Knicks fan, it's already happened. We have loads to get through, so I'm not going to dwell too much on sport, but we want to say a big thanks to our burgeoning group of Patreon subscribers, the OGs, the founding tier members who are kind of crystallized, memorialized. You can no longer become a founding member, but that status is locked in for life for those people who signed up on that tier. We've got our supporters who paid $10 a month to get extended post-match analysis, as I'm calling it now. And and also our insiders, which is the new version of the founding tier, who will get longer episodes, but also get a direct line to Mike and I to suggest articles that we missed, where we went wrong, VAR calls and decisions that perhaps we got wrong. So go to patreon.com/Ctrl-Alt-Speech for that. We are going to start actually, Mike, with a story that was suggested by one of our Patreon supporters. And we're going to expand on that. Our first big story really looks at child safety announcements made by Apple this week. But it kind of begins somewhere in the middle of last week with the ongoing dance between politicians who are clearly keen to win votes and big tech companies who many voters have taken a keen dislike to. So one of our Patreon supporters, Joe, highlighted a story last week that was previewing a speech by my fair Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, in London Tech Week this week. And Keir, this article kind of highlighted, was going to insist that Google and Apple would do more to keep kids safe. And the focus of that particular story was the fact that Google and Apple execs could face prison time if they didn't do so.
Yeah.
And I know you love stories like this. I know you've got things to say. When this story kind of made it into our Signal chat, what did you make of it?
I mean, it's the same old thing. And it's very much, and that original article came out before he'd given the speech, and then he gave the speech, and it was the exact encapsulation of the nerd harder problem, which was these companies better wave their magic wand and not allow anything bad to happen on their platform, or they're going to jail. And it's just so unrealistic, and it creates such twisted incentives where not only are you asking for the impossible, you're then threatening literal prison time for not doing the impossible. That doesn't create good incentives for actually building better systems that are actually safer for children. And so I find this very performative and showy and not particularly helpful or realistic.
Yeah. There's a reasons why politicians use the prison time threat. We won't go into the kind of depths of that, but it doesn't create the right incentives. I think, as you say, the speech actually took place this week on Monday.
Yep.
And the thing that was reported very widely was a 3-month deadline for Google and Apple to prevent nudity on those platforms. So they basically, Starmer said, you've got 3 months to ban nude images on children's devices as part of an effort to keep kids safe. And for those of you not very close to kind of UK politics right now, Keir Starmer is under a lot of pressure. There is a guy called Andy Burnham who is standing in a by-election next week, who people are thinking might be the next prime minister. So Starmer is in kind of survival mode, and one of his kind of survival efforts is to bolster his child safety, internet safety credentials. And so that was a really interesting moment in itself. That was going to be probably our big story, and we were going to kind of unpack some of that. Then, at the same time, Mike, on the same Monday, Apple did their big developer conference in Cupertino. And guess what? They checkmated Keir Starmer. Or at least I think so. And I'm keen to hear what you think. Just to give you an overview, for those who aren't staying close to the kind of the tech news scene, this is The WWDC, the conference that Apple hosts every year, normally does a kind of product showcase explaining all the great features and functionality that it has launched for its developer community, but also for users of Apple products. It was a big one because it's Tim Cook's last one, but it also was a big moment for Apple taking kind of center stage in terms of its safety efforts. It is very much worth watching at least a 10-minute clip about trust and safety in its entirety. We're actually going to play a bit for you now just to give you a sense of what it's like. So take a listen to this and see what you think.
Our long-standing commitment to safety is especially important when it comes to kids and teens who rely on our devices to stay in touch, to explore creativity and enhance learning, and to build their independence as they grow. And as parents ourselves, we're committed to building a safe and trusted platform for kids. So this year, we're taking a big step, expanding our child safety features with powerful and intuitive tools.
So that is a clip from the Apple presentation. You hear some of the trust and safety executives talking about what they're planning to do. There's a whole bunch of features, so I'll just kind of go over them. Pretty significant changes to how they do safety. The biggest one I thought was the Ask to Browse feature, which builds on what they do in the App Store already, which is allowing children to request access to specific websites via a parent. So to kind of essentially gatekeep particular websites that parents might not want children to access, which is maybe quite burdensome for parents, but it's probably going to give them a lot of comfort and feeling of safety. They've also expanded what Keir Starmer has essentially asked for, which is they already have this ability to prevent nudity on messages and FaceTime calls. And they've expanded that to also contain images that reflect gore or violent content. So they're going to be blurred now as well on the messages and FaceTime apps. And then they did a big also announcement about screen time. Screen time is a big issue for parents. They've made those controls much more granular, so you can now specify not just kind of screen time overall, but entertainment apps, games apps, and social apps now can have particular time allowances. And you can schedule different time allowances for different days, should you wish as well. So if you want to allow your kid to watch a film on the weekend, you don't want to use certain apps on a Tuesday or a Wednesday after school, you'll be able to do that within Apple's safety features. So it's a big moment, I think, in lots of ways, not least because politicians have gone after Apple and Google in trying to get them to do more, but also because, Apple are going to take an even bigger role in the trust and safety stack, Mike, which is we'll talk a bit about. What was your assessment of this big announcement from them?
Yeah, I mean, there are a bunch of different angles to this. So one, which you sort of alluded to, but there was an interesting article in 9to5Mac that actually called this out, where the normal WWDC presentation sort of walks through the different operating systems and the different systems that Apple has and sort of talks about new features for each one. Whereas this one had like this entire section on trust and safety, which is new and stands out and is unique and certainly interesting. And so that is on its own worth noting and calling out, and the sort of central focus of trust and safety, which obviously we think is important. So I sort of lump the announcements here into sort of like the good, the bad, and the ugly categories, because there are different elements to this. One, the good, the features here that they've talked about and safety features, I think are very good. And I think Apple in particular has always done a pretty good job of thinking through safety features and actually thinking through them for the most part in a very thoughtful way that are privacy protective and that really do help and are useful in protecting children and being actually useful. And so I appreciate that. And it's nice to see sort of the latest generation of those. The bad part where I get a little bit more nervous about it is the idea that it might start to lock in Apple as sort of essential infrastructure for child safety. This is my concern, where you have this one large company that becomes such a central piece of it. If we start to look at the operating system providers as having to be the sort of controllers of all of the safety features, that puts a lot of power in their hands. And while we can say that, well, we can hope that Apple is a sort of benevolent dictator, those sorts of things tend to get corrupted over time. And it becomes a riskier and riskier situation when they are sort of locked in and they have too much power. And so this is, what some of, the essay that I published last week that we spoke about becomes a potential issue. And then the sort of ugly end of it, I think, is there is an element of this, and as with everything, there are trade-offs that I feel sets this standard of surveillance, that we're sort of training our kids that surveillance is the norm and that they should expect to be surveilled at all times. And I think that itself is somewhat unhealthy. And I think obviously there are different levels to this and different ways to think about it. And obviously for younger kids, you want parents looking over their shoulder or trusted adults who are teaching them how to use the tools appropriately and in an age-appropriate way and all of these kinds of things. But I worry about a world in which we sort of bake in this idea that you are going to be surveilled until you're 18, and then we suddenly let you loose in the world without the surveillance. I think there are longer-term consequences to that are really problematic. And that if we sort of accept this position that this is the way it is, everything that you do and every conversation that you have is being tracked and monitored, every app that you access, all that kind of stuff, over time, that is not a particularly healthy situation either.
Okay. Let's kind of start at the ugly end of that spectrum. What are you kind of most concerned about? Or where do you see that kind of surveillance going? Because, these changes aside, as we all know, internet users are surveilled in lots of different ways for purposes of being served advertising. It's the kind of probably most egregious. What is it that this particular type of, kind of profiling might be used for?
There's a few different elements to it, but part of it is just sort of baking it in as if it's necessary, right? Like the other kinds of surveillance aspects that you're talking about, there are things that users can do to avoid, right? There are steps that you can take to avoid those or to limit those or limit the impact of it. And it's something that there are other tools out there. This is more baking it in as like a core feature that has to be there in order to use these tools. If you're a certain age, it is expected that you are going to be watched in all sorts of ways. And I just sort of worry a little bit about the kind of message that sends and the kind of expectations that leads to, especially for younger people, that actually it is important for younger people to have their own thoughts and have freedom. This goes to a different extent. And again, like I talked about this a little bit in that piece that I had written last week, the idea that Danny O'Brien had put together of cognitive liberty. That when everything that you're doing is controlled by centralized parties who can see what you're doing and track what you're doing, it actually limits your ability to think freely. And that itself is a problem. And I'm not saying like, nobody should ever, you can't have any other restrictions or guardrails or all that kind of stuff. Again, these are all about trade-offs. But the idea that we're baking it in entirely, that everything you do is going to be monitored and tracked and watched. And again, there's like an implicit assumption when we're talking about parental controls in particular, there's an implicit assumption that parents know what's best for their kids. And that is not always true. And there are obviously kids who have poor relationships with their parents. They're estranged, kids who are estranged from their parents. There's all sorts of things where these things could go wrong as well. And yet, if we're giving those adults the power to track, monitor, limit every little aspect of what that child does, I can see where that can lead to harms as well. And again, there are obviously situations where that's not true and that it is helpful to have that. And I do think like tools for parents and kids should be this sort of like ongoing negotiation of what is appropriate and what is not. But I worry when you have one company that starts to take over and it becomes this sort of thing that the government is expecting them to do, and you have fewer options in terms of how you lay out those tools and how you use them.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I'm not going to play defense for Apple here, but one of the points I kind of noted was how people have been calling for Apple to play this role increasingly. And I think it's worth laying that out for listeners. So, there's, to begin with, Starmer's comments about Apple and Google taking an outsized role in the kind of safety stack and doing more to protect children is, in my mind, as a result of a lot of campaigners, campaigning groups pushing for a stronger kind of online safety regime. And that, I think, has led, whether they knew it or not when they started pushing politicians to make these changes, into a situation where politicians like Starmer are pushing Google and Meta and Apple to do these things. So I think that there has been a push from, I think, the desperation of some parents, and I'm hoping to speak to some of those in the future on the podcast, has kind of led to this. That's the first thing. The other thing is that there have been trust and safety experts and people working in platforms who've also, over the last few years, sowed this seed that Apple and Google should play more of a role via the App Store. So you had Antigone Davis, who was Facebook's, I was going to say deceased. She's left the company. She's the former global head of safety.
To Zuckerberg, deceased.
Yeah. She, in 2023, made the point that Apple should do more. Zuckerberg actually, I think, spoke about Apple doing more in a deposition of some sort soon afterwards. And then Yoel Roth, who's been on the podcast and now works at Match Group in 2024, also said that he would like to see Apple play more of a role. And I think probably both of those figures were thinking that Apple, being a controller of the kind of age assurance element, was the least worst option, as you say, the benevolent dictator approach, and that they're well positioned in the stack to do that. As you say, we don't know what the potential implications of that are for children or parents. But in my mind, it feels like the kind of best of the options right now. But I obviously I don't have a crystal ball.
And I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. I mean, of the other options out there of who might do this, they probably are all worse. And I do think that Apple does a fairly good job of this. But the other side of that is then it also sort of locks Apple in as critical infrastructure in a way that, it was amusing to me to watch Meta really strongly. For years, they've pushed the idea that, push all of the age verification stuff to Apple and Google so that we don't have to do it. But all that does is really lock in Apple and Google as these central providers who are critical infrastructure and have to be there. And it gives them a lot more power. And over time, that power is going to get abused.
Yeah. And just to be clear, this announcement isn't speaking to the age verification aspect, because we mentioned it on the podcast back in March. That has rolled out in the UK. So in one of the latest OS updates, you, as a UK user, had to say that you were above 18, and that information is what gets passed on to app developers. It's not only in the UK that happens, it also happens in Singapore, in South Korea, and I believe in Texas as well. So it's a small number of states, jurisdictions where that happens. But with this new announcement of them, I guess, differentiating themselves, let's say, through safety measures like screen time and the kind of website approval process, I think there's a really interesting shift there. And it is worth noting as well, Apple and Google often get kind of made out to be similar companies, but Google had their own developer conference a few weeks ago and didn't really talk about these kind of safety measures at all. There was a few quite technical Chrome and App Store changes, but nothing to this extent. Definitely didn't spend a large chunk of the presentation talking about trust and safety. And so I noted that Benedict Evans, who's a kind of industry analyst, noted that this could be Apple's new marketing ploy. In the same way that kind of privacy has been its focus for many, many years, it might be the trust and safety they feel is going to be a differentiator against Google in a world where parents are very concerned about teen safety and, regulators are going to be increasingly kind of watching them. So it's a big signal, I would say, as to how things are moving. And trust and safety professionals probably will be delighted by that. A big company like Apple pinning their hopes in some ways on safety as a marketing tool, as having good ROI in kind of industry terms, that will please a lot of folks who read tech dirt and read everything in moderation.
Yeah, and I think it is an outgrowth of their focus on privacy over the last few years. I would argue that they probably see those as connected. The sort of privacy to trust and safety connection is not moving in a different direction. It's sort of leaning further into the idea of like protecting the user.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. There's a lot more we could say on this. I would definitely recommend going to watch that segment again. We will include it in the show notes. There's a couple of Apple's trust and safety folks are actually giving the speech and up on stage with the kind of head of engineering who kind of leads a lot of the presentation. So it's trust and safety front and center for sure. We'll move on to our kind of eye-catching section, Mike, where we've got a couple of stories that we want to flag to listeners before we deep dive into the Anthropic model. We probably should kind of talk a little bit about, before we do that, Canada.
Yes.
Which in the last kind of 24 hours has finally got its act together and put out its own digital regulation kind of update, which isn't that far away from what the UK has been doing over the last few years.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's part and parcel with what Australia has done and what the UK is doing. Canada is now introducing its own sort of online safety bill, which is a little bit vague at this point. They released it just yesterday. A lot of it is sort of left up to, the idea is setting up regulatory bodies and which will determine a bunch of the factors. I mean, this is, as far as I can tell, sort of a Canadian specialty where they will sort of release a law and then the actual implementation goes into effect later. It's not true. It's just Canada. There's plenty of other countries that do similar sorts of things as we've seen. But it's clearly this pattern of setting up rules, limiting children's access to social media, putting more onus on social media companies, including some sort of duty of care, duty of responsibility to try and force the companies to do more to keep people safe. But like the vagueness is part of the problem, where it's easy to say that. It's very, very difficult to understand how do you actually do that in a way that doesn't have unintended consequences that cause more harm than they solve. But, like Starmer's speech at the beginning, it's a thing that on the political front, a lot of folks feel that they need to do this and that they have to focus on these tech companies as being harmful and evil, and therefore there must be a law passed. And this is Canada's attempt to do that. And it really picks up on the exact same things that have come before it in the UK and Australia as well. And we'll be following the specifics of that as we go, but it's another one of those kinds of laws, basically.
Yeah, and we'll see if Canada gets a bit of a second mover advantage here, because they've been able to see how the UK and Australia regimes have been rolled out and some of the challenges. So that will be interesting. Talking of Australia, Mike, this is a story that, it makes sense if we've covered two of the big Commonwealth countries to also include
absolutely
a third big one. So Australia announcing that there's going to be a slight change to how they regulate some of the company.
Yeah, I mean, this is also, it fits with this entire discussion that we've been having today, which is that these countries are trying to regulate these things. And Australia obviously was up front with their social media ban for teenagers, which, as we've discussed over and over again, I would argue has not been particularly successful. And there keeps coming out more and more data showing that teenagers are still accessing these services. And in fact, the cases where kids have been cut off from the services, there are plenty of stories of people where it was helpful. I mean, there was a whole thing on children with disabilities who were cut off from support groups because they couldn't access them anymore because of the social media ban. But then you see all the stories of kids tricking or parents helping kids get around these bans and all these sorts of things. So Australia is now, they're sort of framing it as we're building on this, but with more enforcement. But what to me that says is it's an acknowledgement that the social media ban has been a total failure. And so rather than admit that they were going down the wrong road, now they're just going to blame the tech companies for not effectively banning kids from doing what they want to do, which is talk to their friends and communicate with different communities. And so basically the plan for Australia now is to ramp up the enforcement side of it. So basically pulling out the stick, just as Starmer was saying, we're going to start throwing officials from tech companies into jail. This is Australia sort of figuring out what sort of bigger stick can we take out to force companies to wave the magic wand and suddenly make the internet safe and make sure that no kids ever have anything bad happen to them. And so to me, it's funny how this particular story is portrayed as sort of like a continuation of what was already done rather than as an acknowledgement of the complete failure of the under 16 ban in Australia, which I think it really is. But it just kind of goes to show that these things don't stay in one place. And even if you have a particular plan, as soon as you find out like kids are still using the internet, bad things are happening to kids because bad things happen to some kids all the time. If you pinned all of the blame on the tech companies, you're just going to go further and further and try and say the companies need to magically wave their magic wand and stop it.
And so this kind of is, you mentioned the kind of enforcement regime. There's also an element of kind of a duty of care that Australia wants companies to have, and is that trying to get them to kind of be kind of more proactive and preemptive of risk with a focus on product safety rather than trying to ban?
Yeah, and that's always been a part of a lot of the regulatory approaches. That's in the Canadian one as well. It's in a bunch of other bills and other places, this idea of a duty of care. The duty of care is one of these things that sounds really good until you really think about it or understand what the impact is. I mean, who could be against a duty of care, right? You want companies to care, right? You want companies to be careful and to think through the consequences of what they do. But as soon as you put that into the law as a duty, as something that is required, then it becomes a compliance thing. This gets back to Daphne Keller's famous trust and safety becoming a compliance function. And so now suddenly you're checking boxes for a regulatory regime rather than figuring out how can we experiment and how can we actually do things that make people safer. Instead, it's how can we do things that won't get us held liable. And those are two different things. There may be some overlap, and the approach that people take is different. And now it becomes what is going to limit our liability versus what will actually make people safer. There obviously is probably some level of overlap, but the reality is that when you have a duty of care, historically what tends to happen is to reduce liability is you just start blocking like crazy. It becomes a kind of censorship regime because you're trying to avoid the liability. And whether or not that makes people safer is a separate question.
Yeah. Okay. You can quickly see how that could end badly. I mean, it does link actually to our next eye-catching story in a very neat way. I don't know if you did that on purpose. This is a story from one of our patrons, Emma. Thanks for sending this in, Emma. The kind of original story is about the Oversight Board issuing a case judgment against Meta in relation to a user who on Instagram sent abuse to a female journalist in which there was threats of violence, and that user was banned permanently. And the case actually kind of stands up for Meta and says that was the right course of action for a number of reasons. But what the case judgment goes into is a lot of interesting kind of discussion about how Meta deals with permanent account bans, which has become an increasingly kind of fraught issue. I don't know if you don't have to go very far around the internet, Mike, comment threads. You probably get people on Tech Dirt. There's lots of replies on Twitter, people saying, I've lost access to my Meta account, mainly.
Yep.
I don't know what to do. It's my small business. It's my child's football account, whatever it might be. I've been summarily banned. I don't know what to do. There are no means of retribution or redress. And what the Oversight Board judgment looks at is the need for Meta to really improve the way it explains why accounts get banned, the reasons if an account is taken down and permanently banned, also the kind of appeals process to be much clearer and much more transparent, to allow users to essentially follow their appeal through the system. And again, I think this for me is one of the most underreported stories in lots of ways, is how many people this is happening to. We really have no sense of it because there's no public data apart from some reports that are coming out via out-of-court dispute settlement bodies in the EU. But it's I feel like we're seeing the kind of iceberg, the tip of the iceberg when it comes to account takedowns, Mike. And I think Emma's point was there's been some really positive reaction to this judgment from Meta. She flags a national coalition against censorship response. A few other organizations have inputted into the process and have celebrated what the Oversight Board have said. And we're yet to see what Meta will do with that. But do you feel also that it's as big a problem as the Oversight Board is saying?
As I'm known to do, I see a lot of nuance in this and trade-offs. So it's like there is an element that, yes, it's always a little worrisome when these companies are total black boxes and you have no idea how the decision-making process gets done, and there's no appeals process and there's no clear way to deal with mistakes. That customer service is a problem. And as we noted last week, Meta may be trying to improve customer service with AI, but that leads to other kinds of problems.
Right.
These are difficult things. And so having more transparency and clear due process and a clear process and for dealing with these things feels good and important. But also the thing that I will remind people of is that you have bad actors who will game those systems, right? So there are reasons why companies, and Meta in particular, I think, tend to be fairly secretive about these things. And part of it is that, one, as soon as you're explaining to someone, this is why we're banning you, if they are a bad actor, if they are nefarious or malicious, they will use that against you, right? First, they'll sort of rules lawyer you and say, well, I didn't do that. I didn't violate that rule. If you tell them exactly which rule you violated, they will say, I didn't do that. And they will argue down to this or that point. And often the really malicious ones will then go to literal court and say, they said this, and that was defamatory because I didn't break this rule. And it is a huge waste of time. And this is why, like, I've seen people say, it'd be really nice to have a policy for social media that is effectively like the I wasn't born yesterday rule, which is like, you're just trying to mess with us and we're banning you because we don't have time for that. And at the scale of Meta, you can't really do that. That is, that doesn't really work. And that's what this ruling, I think, is a kind of response. It's like, no, you actually have to have rules and processes in place. And that includes due process. That does include transparency. But I think what this ruling and the celebration of it leave out is not everybody who was banned will accept the sort of transparent explanation or the due process. And in fact, they will just weaponize that in some way or another. And so companies often will sort of be less transparent and have less clear appeals processes because they know that it's just going to be used against them.
Yeah. I mean, I've spoken about the LinkedIn issue that I had where everything in moderation was disappeared and I had to go to great lengths to get that page back and up and running. I certainly feel like there's a greater degree of information about the process, about where you are in the chain that could help. I agree that actually sharing what's going on behind the scenes could be problematic in the long run. But again, we get to see what Meta are going to do with this. They sometimes take the oversight board responses and do something with it. In other cases, they don't. So we'll see. But I think that probably, I'd say, is enough for our free listeners this week, Mike. It's probably more than they can take. They also, I think, probably have World Cup games to go and watch and listen to. But if you're a sucker for more, this week's Ctrl-Alt-Speech Plus will look at the rocky start that the Fable 5 model has had and what it means for the way that AI labs think about safety. Before we dive in, Mike, why do you think this one deserves a deeper discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously what is happening in the AI world as it relates to online speech and online safety is incredibly important, and understanding where that's going and how the big companies are acting and where they're making mistakes is really, really important to understanding more broadly across the internet how speech and safety are going to intersect with one another. And I think that there are a bunch of lessons that can be taken from the way that Anthropic rolled out Fable and Mythos, its two sort of latest version models this week, and what is maybe working and what is not working. It's a really important discussion to have.
That's the end of this week's free edition of Ctrl-Alt-Speech. To hear the extended episode with additional coverage, become a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/Ctrl-Alt-Speech. That's CTRL-Alt-Speech. If your organization is interested in sponsoring the podcast, contact us via our website at Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. Thanks for listening.